Welcome to Home Education Matters, the weekly podcast supporting you on your home education journey. Hello and welcome to another episode of Home Education Matters. And today I'm joined by Paul Turner from 3A Tutors, and we are going to be talking about the nuts and bolts of exams when it comes to home education, because for most parents, exams are stressful times of the year, but they kind of shoo their child off to school and it all gets done for them. When you home educate, it's a lot more hands-on and you have to plan and you have to think about how things are going to work. And I thought it would be good to have somebody from an exam centre come on and talk us through all the things that we need to know in the run-up to the exams, on the day of the exams, and after the exams. And Paul is from my favourite exam centre because he's from the exam centre that my children have used all the way through. And we like it so much that we do sort of 4-hour round trips to go to this exam centre. So that's a good testimony to how much I like the exam centre. So first of all, Paul, thank you so much for coming on. And do tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into 3A Tutors and how you became an exams officer.
Oh, cool. Yes. So I've been with 3A now for 15 years. And much like probably most people in my generation, obviously went to university and came out with a degree. And actually I was like, well, I don't quite know what I want to do. And then obviously looking at various jobs. And then I saw a vacancy for 3A tutors, and I came in and met Dr. Monks, the head of centre, and just basically chatting to him and his vision for the company and what he wanted to do in trying to help home educated students, but also, students in general with tuition, exams. I thought it was amazing, and I just want to be a part of that journey.
Are you just an exams officer or are you a tutor as well?
So I am now solely an examinations officer. So back when, I graduated, I did used to tutor, but now, I'm fully an examinations officer.
I know that from my brief foray into being a teacher, that the exams officer at a school was always the most stressful job that nobody wanted to do, and you always kind of got like a little bit extra on your salary, but not enough to warrant how stressful being an exams officer is. So it must be, and you must have, because obviously you have multiple sittings, and it's not, I think we tend to consider it, well, it's, like 6 weeks or something every summer, but actually there's a lot in the run up. And then I'm guessing you have a lot afterwards, and then you have double sitting. So it must be quite time consuming as well.
Yes, it certainly is. I think obviously we're now into July, so this would be what I consider sort of one of the quieter periods of the year. But yeah, I mean, it's very much a role that, in terms of the summer series, we like to think that pretty much for us starts January.
Wow.
So obviously you've got all the students registering. Obviously many students register earlier, but I'd say the bulk of students register, very much like the January, early February leading up to the deadline. And then as soon as obviously you've got all the students registered, there's the planning, the preparation, and that does take, good couple of months to get everything ready for when obviously the students arrive to sit the exams.
So I'm guessing that this section now in between the exams and the results is your little lull in the process, is it?
Yeah, it's definitely the time now where obviously, staff can take a bit of annual leave, take a few, days off here and there. And it just gives us a chance to sort of regroup. There's always things that we think we could do better, and we'll always try to think, how could we improve things moving forward? And obviously, start to maybe look at other ways to market ourselves to, potentially more students. But yeah, relatively, this is, the quieter period of the year.
So Paul is going to be talking us through a number of exam topics, and I'm just going to give our listeners a little rundown so they know what they can expect. We're going to be talking about the different exam sittings, how exams work, what the process is, any tips or advice that you've got, access arrangements. I am doing another podcast purely on access arrangements because it's such a big topic, but we're going to sort of glide into that a little bit. Coursework, oral exams, practical endorsements, rules of the exam room, which I feel like I know, having listened to the speeches at the start of every exam for like God knows how many exams this summer. I feel like I could recite them myself. Special consideration, results and certificates, appeals, post-exam procedures, and resits. That's a lot.
It certainly is. It's definitely makes you realise actually, like there's quite a lot to it.
There is a lot to it, and we take it for granted. I think, like school parents take it for granted how much is done by the school, and then when suddenly your child is not in the school setting, you find yourself having to think about these things that you never thought you'd have to think about. You know, the kind of, like I say, the nuts and bolts of exams. So let's talk first about exam sittings.
Yeah. So I mean, pretty much you've got. I mean, I think everyone is. Most people are aware of the summer exam series. That's obviously the one you see in the media, the ones obviously schools talk about, and that's obviously when all exams are available. So you've got your GCSEs, your IGCSEs, your A-levels. The summer series, that's the big one. But you've also got an autumn series as well, which isn't on the same scale as the summer series, but a lot of qualifications are available then. So, I mean, in the autumn, in November, you've got your GCSE maths and your GCSE English retakes.
Is that if you're over 16?
So that's correct, yes. So there is the exam boards do put that sort of stipulation on the English and maths exams in November. That was obviously brought in a few years back now as trying to prevent schools entering students twice in the same year for English and maths. So I think they were finding that some schools were entering their students in, say, November, and then hoping they'd get the grade, and if not, they'd put them in for another chance in the summer, which obviously for schools that financially could do that, it was an advantage. So basically they just put this sort of stipulation in to prevent schools giving some students that advantage.
That's just the GCSEs though, right?
Yeah,
so IGCSEs not
that's
affected.
just at GCSE English and maths. But yeah, I mean, in terms of IGCSEs, so obviously you've got the Pearson EdXL IGCSEs are available in November, and you've also got the Cambridge IGCSEs, but there's no age restrictions on those. So students of all ages can take them for the first time in that October-November series. And then you've also got like the Cambridge International A-levels as well that students can take. So yeah, so there is this autumn series, which particularly those doing like IGCSEs is a great opportunity to take qualifications outside of that main exam series.
So when you're talking about age, there are no age restrictions for exams of any type, right?
No, none whatsoever. So students of any age can sit examinations. Our experience at 3A Tutors, we've had students as young as 7 take like GCSE maths exams. And then we've had students in their early 80s take subjects that were, of personal interest to them. So, and we get ages, all in between that. So, there is certainly no age restriction when it comes to examinations.
What happened to the January exams? Have they just been abolished now?
So, I mean, in terms of the January exams, you used to have, many years ago, you used to have, when A-levels were back where they were modular, you used to have a January series, but that ended very much, I think 2013 was the last January series for A-levels. And then EdXL used to do their IGCSEs in January, but I think following on from the pandemic, they've realized the demand is greater in the November series. So they've sort of just brought everything sort of forward in the academic year. So rather than have them in January, they brought them to November. And I think from what Dave said, it just works better for them as a global exam board so that they can cater for that global audience.
Yeah, I'm guessing because a lot of schools in other hemispheres are off around about January, right?
Exactly that. And I imagine that, some schools in, obviously like Southern Hemisphere work on, obviously their school year would work on like the calendar. So obviously they can then be sitting their exams sort of at the end of the school year in that November period, sort of prior to their summer holidays.
It's a shame I liked the January exams, but there you are. It is what it is. So the autumn sitting is October, November.
That's correct. Yeah.
Summer sitting is May, June, although it's also end of April as well, right?
Yeah, with the Cambridge IGCSEs and international A levels, they very much usually kick off sort of end of April. And obviously there's other things like oral exams that, take place even before that. So although it's called the summer exam series, I very much see it as sort of a April through to end of June is sort of that time frame you're looking at.
Is there a date when it's all done in summer so everyone can be like, okay, now I can book my summer holidays, for example?
Yeah, so they have what's referred to as a contingency day. So this usually occurs. It's usually like the final Tuesday of like June. They put this contingency day in place, so just in case during the summer exam series, if anything happened, like a national incident or anything like that, they could use this day as sort of a backup to put exams on. So that's officially the final day where all students need to be available to sit examinations. And then after that, they can go off and enjoy their summer holidays.
Okay, so that's exam sittings, 2 a year, April, May, June, mid-April to kind of mid-June-ish, and then October, November. And that's mid-October to mid-November.
I would say, with the autumn series, in some years, I've seen Cambridge put them very much at the end of September, but historically, you're sort of looking first week of October through to sort of the last week of November. And in terms of what, an important thing to note with those series is in terms of registration, students need to be registering for that autumn series sort of by early September. And then for the summer series that we've mentioned, again, early February would sort of be the time when they need to be looking to register with a centre.
Do you need to, for popular exams, like, for example, English language and maths, do you need to be booking earlier than that? Is that like the latest you can do it rather than ideal?
Our centre, with our recommendation for, popular subjects, like you touched on, GCSE maths, IGCSE maths, English, these subjects, I would always recommend you looking to register sort of by January time, just because they are popular and centres will only have so much space to accommodate these subjects. And if you want to make sure you've got that place, I would say January. But, this year we did still have spaces up to early February. So it sort of varies on a year-to-year basis, but I would say January would be your best bet.
Okay, and actually, while you were mentioning that, something occurred to me, because obviously we can book in nice and early, and I know that your exam centre has a exam instalment kind of payment plan thing, which is really helpful because exams are expensive, and so you can make monthly payments. And I wanted to ask you something that I have not prepped you for the fact that I'm going to ask you this, so apologies.
That's fine.
I noticed that not just you, but all the exam centres, all the fees went up quite considerably about just over a year ago. And it seemed to, now this is just my like conspiracy theory brain, it seemed to coincide with not being able to charge for the access arrangements, because I felt like it coincided. Was it the case that fees went up to kind of absorb that cost?
No, I can't speak for obviously other centres, but in terms of us, it was very much more, they went up as a reflection of obviously inflation and where the economy was, obviously everything was going up. Obviously, in the wider society, I think everybody noticed everything was going up, and I think we just sort of realised we had to match very much that. But obviously, that is an interesting point you raise about obviously the access arrangements and obviously how centres could no longer, charge any additional fees for that. So, for some centres there may have been played into their thinking, but I can, say from 3A tutors' point of view, that didn't come in at all. It was just a case of inflation and where the economy was at.
Let's talk about access arrangements. And as I say, I am doing a whole podcast on this because it is a thorny topic. But I know that during the pandemic, my daughter had to use tutors and exams for one of her exams because her tutor was registered with them so she could get her certified grade. And she has dyslexia, and she had an access arrangements test, and it cost a lot of money. It was like £300-400, and it was literally 10 minutes on Zoom. The guy was like, write something down, show me what you wrote. Yes, you can have extra time and a laptop, right? And I remember thinking at the time, It's a bit ridiculous. However, it was fine. She got her access arrangements, but it kind of bugged me because it was a lot of money. And she had, obviously, my daughter had an official diagnosis and she had all of this stuff. And so I couldn't really understand why she had to pay for access arrangements. Now, then I moaned about this a lot on the Facebook forums. And then the next year, people were coming on and saying, well, I'm not paying for access arrangements. And I was thinking, what happened here? Was I scammed? And then something changed, didn't it? Where suddenly nobody was getting charged anymore for access arrangements. Was that a government thing?
Obviously, I don't know who made the decision sort of higher up, but yeah, it came in, I believe it was September 2021. So it's sort of the start of the 21-22 academic year. And basically JCQ, so the Joint Council for Qualifications, obviously they oversee all the awarding bodies, and they're obviously make all the regulations and guidelines that we as centres and schools have to follow. Basically, one of the things they brought in was that centres, schools cannot charge candidates for making any reasonable adjustments.
So instead, I'm guessing that when it comes to access arrangements, instead of having to sit a test for the centre, now you supply evidence, do you?
So in terms of, when you say sit a test, so students that maybe have what we'd refer to as a learning difficulty do need, there's different types of evidence a student would need to qualify for access arrangements. So one of them would be if they had an EHCP, so an educational healthcare plan, if they had one of those. For students that maybe don't have one of those, they require what's called a JCQ Form 8. Now, this is something that they need an assessor. So for instance, we have an assessor that works within our centre. They would do an assessment with the student. It doesn't usually take, I can only speak for our centre, but they usually take an hour and a half to complete. It's obviously a series of assessments. And then basically they will fill in the part 2 of this form that basically is like standardized scores for things like writing speed, processing speed, reading speed, these types of things. And depending on the scores that come up from that assessment would dictate whether a student could, qualify for extra time, scribe, these types of access arrangements.
Okay, so I know that we've done a podcast on EHCPs, and so I went from a baseline of knowledge of 0 to a baseline of knowledge of a lot. So I know that people will be listening to this thinking EHCPs, that sounds a dream, no chance of that. And so this assessment that you mentioned, the G something.
So it's an exams access arrangement assessment. So obviously I can only speak again for our centre, but we have our own appointed assessor that can complete this assessment. It's not necessarily to provide a formal diagnosis. It's purely to discover whether a student qualifies for access arrangements for their exams.
And that will be things like extra time, laptop use, scribe, text to type, that kind of thing?
Primarily with that, it would be for extra time and use of a scribe in their exams, not necessarily other arrangements. Those would be the 2 key access arrangements that would be sort of determined by that assessment. Laptop use? Laptop use doesn't need a formal assessment. That's usually to do with a student's normal way of working. So obviously if you had a student that had poor handwriting, so it was illegible, that student wouldn't need an assessment to qualify to use a word processor. We would usually say, for instance, in that situation, ask for like handwriting samples. And obviously, if it was illegible, then we would be able to give them the use of a word processor. Also if they had a diagnosed medical condition or a disability that meant handwriting was, hard for them, then again, if they could provide that, you give them the use of word processor and they wouldn't necessarily have to, have this assessment. The assessment is primarily for students with learning difficulties, things like dyslexia, dyscalculia.
And how much is the assessment? I know it probably differs from centre to centre, but how much is your one?
So to have that assessment, our centre is £125.
All right, and that would give you extra. And is extra time always like 25% or something, or is it?
It's 25% is very much the standard. Obviously, you can apply for extra time over 25%. This is where, for instance, what we just discussed, if you're having an assessment, obviously the standardized scores that sort of are uncovered from that assessment, if they were particularly low and sort of in multiple areas, so if a student had a particularly below average score in, say, writing speed and also processing speed, and it was, significantly low, they may qualify for, say, 50% extra time or even greater. But typically when a student has a certain range of scores, they usually is 25% is the sort of standard.
And so you mentioned the EHCP. So I'm guessing if they have an EHCP and it's mentioned in the EHCP, then they would get laptop use or whatever, extra time or whatever. But what about if they've just got like a standard diagnosis? So they've got, say somebody's child has an autism diagnosis. Do they still have to sit the exam access arrangement thing?
No. So basically, the assessment would purely be for those with learning difficulties. If you had a student that had, say, like you mentioned, a medical condition such as ADHD, ASD, or it was a physical disability or a sensory impairment, anything that fell into this category, it would be a case of providing medical documentation confirming the formal diagnosis. So if you provided that formal diagnosis, that would be what we would tend to refer to as like the core evidence, and that would sort of fill in instead of having the assessment.
Okay, and are all the exam boards the same? Cambridge, Pearson, all of that? Do they all want the same kind of thing?
So for the most part, yeah, Cambridge do have slightly different requirements, but for the most part, they are still looking for the scores, things that would be uncovered from one of the assessments. One final thing on the arrangements, I mean, it is very much, obviously the evidence we just talked about would certainly be needed. And the other thing that all students do need to provide is sort of what we'd refer to as supplementary evidence, sort of outlining the normal way of working, sort of painting a picture of need of a student's normal, requirements. So this usually takes the form of things like statements from tutors, teachers, or we can get students to come in and sit mock exams, under sort of exam conditions. And it's quite a good one with the mocks. You get a student to come in and you get them to do a mock under time conditions, and you get them to use two different color pens. So one sort of using in the normal time allowance, and then you give them the extra time and they change colors. So it sort of highlights how and where they're applying that extra time. So because some students, they might actually realize actually they don't need it, the extra time. But for those that do, you'll clearly see a distinction where they're getting to a point in the paper and they're having to switch this color. And it's abundantly clear that without that extra time, they're just not finishing the paper. Yeah, like I said, we call these supplementary evidence. And, this, along with the core evidence that we've just discussed, like this is the body of evidence you would need for us to make an application to the exam boards to put these in place ready for the exams.
Okay, so that's access arrangements, and it certainly sounds like there's a different kind of routes in. And so if you think your child needs extra time or extra support, it's worth speaking to your exam centre and really making the case for that, and then preparing like kind of a portfolio of evidence and such like. So next on our topic list, I've got how it works and tips, and I feel like they kind of work together. So talk to me about that, Paul. How does the whole thing work?
Sure. I would say, in terms of how it works, in terms of, say, registering, it is, well, I like to think it is incredibly simple. It is, just a case of contacting us or contacting your centre. You obviously, usually they'll provide you with the information you need to know, usually applicable booking form. And then basically it's a case of then obviously filling in the form, getting yourself registered, paying the applicable fee. and then leaving it with us to take care of all the administration. So we take care of everything. We do everything with the exam boards. We make the entries. The student parents don't need to have any contact with the exam boards. Once we've made those entries, that's when we'll send you the statement of entry, and this will outline like the exam dates, the times, the venue, everything you need to know. And basically, once we've given that to you, it's just a case of coming along on those applicable dates and sitting those exams. And obviously, I appreciate that sounds incredibly simple, but that is very much it in terms of booking in for an examination. That is how simple it can be.
I know that there are some subjects that are harder to book than others, and I don't mean that they get filled up. I mean that they're just difficult to book admin wise. So for example, you need the subject code of the exam that you're sitting. So a lot of people get confused about this. I get a surprising amount of people messaging me who know I know lots about exams, and they're like, I can't find the subject code for maths or English language B or whatever it is. So just for anyone who's listening, you can Google if you Google something like Edexcel English language spec B, it will bring up, I normally put PDF afterwards in the search. So English language Edexcel B PDF, and that brings up the syllabus. And the syllabus on the very front cover of every single one, whether it's Cambridge or Edexcel or AQA or OCR, it always says like a funny little code that is like letters and numbers or just numbers. And it's normally 5 or 6 letters or numbers mixed together. That's the subject code, right?
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, yeah, it is. I mean, I can't speak again for other centres. I mean, what I always say is if a student submits a form to us and they didn't know the subject code, I will usually then go back and clarify with them. So if they put on say they fill in a booking form and they would put in IGCSE English language, we would then usually go back to them and say, thanks for filling the form. You've got 2 options. You've got the A, which is for EA1, or you've got the B, which is for EB1. Could you please confirm which one it is that you wish to be entered for? And we'll always do this, so the codes, yes, they can be found on the specifications, but we will always, just as a matter of course, check them when we get the booking form. And if there's any concern, we'll always clarify with the parent or the student.
You do, Paul, and that's why I do a 4-hour round trip to come to your exam centre, but I can safely say that is not the case for most exam centres.
Sure. So, like you said, yeah, I guess, yeah, if you want to do everything and trust in yourself, yes, if you've got the syllabus, the specification for which you are studying, on the front page it will say usually 4-digit code, usually.
Sometimes it's got a slash, hasn't it?
Slash, yeah, 3-4-digit code, and it's there on the front page, and it will say the subject, and then in brackets will say the code. And sometimes in some of the specifications as well, if you do a search for the entry codes, and then go to that section, it will say specifically this is the entry code for the exams.
The other thing I know that for certain exams like history and classical civilization and things like that, where there are topic options, that is a whole further layer of complexity.
Oh, yes. I mean, history is the subject, as you know, it is. I mean, GCSE history in particular. And the good thing about GCSE history, for both AQA and Edexcel, they have on their website an entry code calculator. And basically, if you type in just to a search engine, Edexcel, GCSE history, entry codes, basically it'll take you through to this page and you can basically input the papers that you're studying. You select, from the options, and then basically at the end it will say your entry code is this, and it will be whatever it is, 1HIO, and then it's usually 2 letters after it. And there's exactly the same for AQA. You can go onto their website and it will give you the entry code. So you can then put that onto the form. And as soon as we see that with the code, we'll know exactly what to put you in, and we'll just pop that in to AQA when we're making the booking.
And the other thing I would say, particularly with history, is that some of the topics, particularly for AQA, are really similarly named. So, because I actually fell foul to this when my daughter was revising, because I printed off the wrong paper and she sat the entire paper and couldn't understand why it kept asking her about the Berlin Wall, and she was doing Vietnam. And it was because one was called something like conflict between East and West, and one was conflict and tension in Asia. And I had just seen conflict and was like, okay, well, this is clearly, yeah. So you do have to double check, triple check, your different subjects, even when you're putting them in the calculator and working out.
Exactly that, yes. Because obviously, the code is going to give you is for what you've put in. I mean, I can only speak for AQ on this one, but when you've done it, it does sort of say you selected these 4 papers, this is your code. So again, do double check. I mean, one thing, again, I can only speak for our centre. As you know, when we send out statements of entry and say these are your exam dates and times, we also do get you to check that the subjects and papers that are listed on there is exactly what you are expecting to take, because we don't want a situation where students turning up on the exam day and they've been entered for the wrong paper.
So I think this is probably one of our first pieces of advice, right, is to double check, triple check, and just make sure they're entered for the right thing. And then when you get the statement of entry from the exam centre that will be emailed to you, or sometimes I know some exam centres have portals that you can access this stuff in. Don't get me started on the portals, because they're an absolute nightmare. But then you need to double check, triple check, and then just make sure that if it's a morning exam or an afternoon exam. And also, I was going to ask you that I think that morning exam doesn't always mean 9. Sometimes it's 9:30. Is it? What are the timings?
So basically, I mean, the official start time for morning is 9 o'clock, and the official start time for an afternoon is 1:30. But centres are, without telling the exam boards, they're allowed to start at 30 minutes either side of this. So obviously, some exam centres, may choose to go for a 9:30 start or a 2 o'clock start. So yeah, each centre will have their own set start times, but it will be sort of it'll be 30 minutes either side of 9 o'clock or 1:30.
Okay, and when it comes to sitting in the car, stuck in a giant traffic jam, super stressing out, you're late for the exam, how late can somebody be for an exam?
So they could be up to within the hour.
So smack on the hour.
So as long as a student arrived by 10 o'clock in the morning or by 2:30 in the afternoon, they would be permitted to sit the exam, and they would be, again, it comes down to an individual centre. A centre, if they've set a rule before where they say, no, you're either here on time or we're not permitting you into the exam, but they can, and obviously at our centre we would, if you were there within the hour, we would let you in and you would have your full time allowance. That wouldn't be cut short at all. So you would still get to sit the exam under full conditions. One thing I would always say, if a student was in that situation where stuck in traffic, stressing out, I would always say, ring the centre, because there should hopefully be a member of staff at the end of that phone that can reassure you to say, look, as long as you get there by 10 o'clock or by 2:30, you will be fine. And just to give that reassurance that it is then, that's what I was saying. And then also, hopefully the member of staff that picks up the phone can then also relay that to, the lead invigilator in the exam room, just so that they're aware that student is going to be slightly late.
What other advice would you have for our home educating parents and home educated children when it comes to exams?
I think the key piece of advice I always have is contact centre as early as possible in the process. So, as soon as you want to sit, exams, contact the centre. One of the main reasons this is to establish the exam boards and routes that centre offers, because not all centres will offer all qualifications. So if you have a certain subject in mind, it's certainly worth checking with the centre which exam boards you're going to do. So definitely before you buy any textbooks or anything like this, establish, what the syllabus is going to be. And, we often get asked, will you get people phone up and say, oh, I'm thinking for 2 years' time, I'm phoning really early. And I will always say, no, you're not. This is perfect. This is when you should be making contact with us before, any studying starts. Obviously, other piece of advice, we'll always advise when people phone is, for certain subjects, the IGCSE is a more accessible route, particularly for English language, the sciences, geography. The IGCSE a home educated student or student outside of mainstream education, it is a better option because the centres don't have to offer the spoken language endorsement for the English. They don't need to be providing that opportunity to do the required practical activities for the sciences or the fieldwork trips for the geography. Obviously, these still form part of the syllabus, but it just makes the relationship between the centre and the student far easier, and it's just far more accessible.
Okay, are there any exams that you don't offer?
Yeah, I mean, there's certain subjects such as PE, drama, dance, design and technology. These are just incredibly difficult to offer to private candidates just due to the extensive coursework, NEA requirements of the syllabus. And also, I mean, for certain examples like AQA in particular, they don't even allow private candidates to sit some of these, specifications. So there would be subjects that aren't available, but I think most people understand why they wouldn't be able to sit those outside of a school environment.
And do you offer anything that isn't GCSE, IGCSE, A-level, international A-level? Do you offer diplomas or I don't know, BTECs, are they called that nowadays?
No, we 3A tutors, we don't offer any BTECs or any of these. Again, I think primarily because of the extensive coursework nature of these types of qualifications. I mean, we host other exams, so there's things like the AAT examinations, so it's like accountancy qualifications, functional skills. So there are other exams that we do offer, but obviously, yes, GCSEs, IGCSEs, A-levels, would be what would be considered the main scope of what we do.
Okay, so for people that are listening who maybe haven't listened to any of my other exams podcasts, let's just reassure people about IGCSEs versus GCSEs.
Yep.
So IGCSEs, international GCSEs, and they're of equal weight and standing to GCSEs.
Oh, completely. I mean, when I first started, obviously 15 years ago, it was the conversation obviously I had to have with people was that very much that reassurance and try to explain to them what it was. I'm finding as the years have gone on, I think it's certainly become more commonplace, and even many schools offer IGCSEs for certain subjects, and I think they're very interchangeable now. And when you're applying for whether it be sixth form college, university, you're listing these qualifications, and it ultimately doesn't make any difference whether they were a GCSE or an IGCSE.
And so when it comes to coursework, I know that the English language GCSE has coursework, and that's probably, I think it's AQA, that's probably the most popular coursework-based GCSE that home educators do. Most home educators, I don't know anyone who does GCSE science. GCSE geography, not particularly popular, but GCSE AQA is still quite popular with home educators purely because if your child has been pulled out of school quite late, they may be halfway through studying this and they don't really want to up sticks and change to IGCSE, which is a very different syllabus. Because obviously with English language, they're all quite different syllabi. So talk to us then about how our listeners who want to do an exam that has coursework, like for example, English language, how would they approach that?
So, I mean, if they were referring to specifically AQA GCSE English language, with that, it's not so much coursework per se, it's a spoken language endorsement. So it's very much a presentation speaking component that students need to fulfill. And obviously doesn't contribute towards the overall grade. It's completely endorsed separately on the certificate. It's not something that 3A do. I mean, primarily the reason for that is the logistics of offering that to the sheer number of students that we would have to support. It's not something that we could cater for. Hence why we do recommend the IGCSE English for that particular subject. I would say if a student was set on doing that particular route, obviously it would be a case of finding a centre that could offer it, and obviously could offer it to a private candidate, and obviously just establishing exactly how they will get them to fulfill that particular requirement. I know that some may do it via Zoom or virtually. Others may insist that you obviously have to attend the centre. So again, that would be my advice on that. Would just when you register or find a centre that can do it for a private candidate, just establish exactly how they're going to ask that portion to be fulfilled. So
you may not know the answer to this question if you don't actually cover this exam, but there's a general belief in the home education community, and I don't know if it's true or not, that's why I'm asking the question, that if you sit AQA English language GCSE and you don't sit the spoken part, it shows up as a fail on the certificate.
So it's reported as what's referred to as not classified.
Which is the same as it would look if you failed.
So basically, that's how the exam was referred to it as not classified. So they don't like to use the terminology fail. But yeah, so if a student either didn't take it or took it and didn't achieve the standard required to pass, yes, they would receive on the certificate, it would say not classified, which is the same. Obviously, we'll move on to when you come to subjects like the A-level sciences and the practical endorsement, it's the same situation there as well.
Okay, so let's then talk, before we move on to practicals when it comes to sciences, let's talk about orals. So foreign language, I know that I'm always amazed how few home educators sit foreign language GCSEs, but having put my son through German, I now fully understand why home educators don't sit foreign language GCSEs, because they're really hard. They're really just hard, and there's a lot of content, and then of course there's 4 different aspects. We've actually done a podcast about modern foreign languages, and so if anyone is interested, do listen to our podcast. It was one of our earliest podcasts, and it talks through the reading, the writing, the listening, and the speaking. Now, I'm assuming that if a child wants to sit Polish, for example, they would need to be able to sit all 4 of those elements with your exam centre.
That's correct, yes. So now that GCSEs are linear, all components have to be sat at the same centre. So you'd have to find a centre that can, support the speaking along with the listening, the reading, and the writing.
When you say linear, you mean not modular, right?
That's correct, yes. So obviously it's been quite a while now, but yeah, it used to be GCSEs, A-levels, it was all modular. So obviously you could take, particularly with A-levels, you could take them over a 2-year period, gradually build up towards that A-level. And same with many GCSEs as well, you could do that. Whereas now it's linear. All it basically means at the end, so obviously in A-levels or GCSEs, at the end of 2 years in a school, college environment, you sit all the exams, and that's that. And
I know that orals, and I think you mentioned this earlier, they're a little earlier in the year than the normal exam period.
That's correct. If you're, in the summer series, centres have a window in which to offer them, and that window is usually from around mid-April to about mid-May. And I think, our experience, and I think knowing other centres, what they do, I think tend to do them very much end of April, as early as possible in May, just so they can be completed prior to the written exams starting, because they do, obviously, as we touched on with Cambridge, they get underway end of April, beginning of May. So obviously a lot of centres want to have that sort of done and dusted before focusing their attentions on the written exams.
Are foreign language exams or exams that have coursework or like geography or anything like that, are they more expensive?
So for modern foreign language exams at our centre, yes, and that additional fee is purely to cover the cost of the oral examiner to conduct the speaking test.
Mm-hmm. Okay. When you were talking about linear exams and modular exams, it reminded me of a question I wanted to ask you about AS levels. Now, I know that a lot of our listeners, it's enough to think about GCSEs, let alone thinking any further ahead. But there are some of us crazy enough to do A-levels as home educators because we're bonkers. And so for those of us that are doing that, are AS levels a thing now, or have they been sort of scrapped?
So they still exist, AS levels, but now they are standalone qualifications. So they don't contribute towards the A-level grade anymore. So unlike when I did my A-levels, you did 2 years, you did AS level in your first year, you did what was referred to as the A2 level in your second year, and you put them together, the AS plus the A2, that gave you your A-level. Whereas now, because the AS level is a standalone qualification, so, in a 6-1 college environment, students may sit that at the end of the first year because it gives them a grade. It is obviously a formal certificate. So if they ever dropped out, they would have something to show for that first year. And obviously in a 6-1 college environment, they may insist on doing that because they want them to put it on their UCAS application. That all being said, if you're doing an A-level once you've done the A level, the AS level grade ultimately counts for very little, because the A level grade is what you will put on your UCAS applications, your CV, job applications. So I would say from our experience, the AS levels, the demand has dropped off significantly, and you'll get still the odd student sit one, but that may be students sitting them that maybe just need a few extra UCAS points. And so they might say, I need to just do an AS level to get the points for that so I can put it on my UCAS application to get into university. But they are few and far between now compared to where it used to be when it was a AS A2 level combination.
So I am doing a podcast coming up, which is, let me just look. It is going to be about the new, it is the new modular IGCSE maths. So I know it's not out yet, but I'm doing a podcast on it because I know that modular exams are very popular with home educators, because it allows it, in actual fact, home educators basically do modular GCSEs in as much as we split them over many years. And so I know that there is a new maths IGCSE coming out that is modular. So I am doing a whole podcast on this because I know it will be popular with home educators. But what can you tell us about that?
So with the Edexcel IGCSEs, they have launched modular in recent, it's only about a year or so ago, I believe. And obviously, initially I think they were purely international, so obviously outside of the UK. It's very similar to like the Edexcel international A levels in that respect. I think it's something that's slowly starting to filter into maybe private centres, much like the Edexcel international A levels, because it offers, as you said, it's a good route for home educated students, and also other students that particularly, again, touching on those with access arrangements, those that need adjustments for their exams. It can reduce the having to put it all in one exam series. It means they can split that learning up and spread it out over a couple of exam series. So it's obviously sort of creeping in now. Where that will end up, I guess we'll sort of see over the coming exam series. I think linear is still very much the here and now, but like modular, I think it's one of those things, if it's certainly a significant demand, you'd hope that the exam boards would take notice of that.
Okay, and before we finish up this little part of the podcast talking about coursework and orals and practicals, I wanted to ask you just briefly about online exams, because I know that there has been a trial, I think it's Edexcel, I'm not sure if it's A levels or GCSE, but there's been a trial of some exams being done on laptops online. I'm guessing you're doing it in a school. I'm not sure, but I know that some home educators are very excited about this as a possibility.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, obviously the future, I think, is, there's two sort of distinctions. You've got on-screen exams, which is students still coming into an exam centre, but doing their papers on a laptop or a computer. And I think that's sort of going to be, I think the plan from the exam boards is to sort of filter that in over the next 5 years or so. And obviously, I think they have plans certainly for like the English language, the English literature, to filter that into sort of just the commonplace. Obviously, there's still practicalities and logistics to work out in that respect. That, for instance, one is very much, you've got now in a school college environment, if you've got, say, 200-300 people sitting GCSE English language in a sports hall, that's one thing at desk. But if every one of those obviously requires a laptop to do it as well, that obviously certainly poses logistical challenges. So I think it is very much the future, but it's obviously, I think the exam boards are talking about bringing it in steadily. I know there's certain subjects that AQA wish to trial over the coming years. I think particularly with languages, they're keen to incorporate like an on-screen exam for the listening aspect. So because obviously at the moment with listening, it's very much the student is purely listening to, say, a CD or an audio file, whereas I think they would like to incorporate actual video clips into their examinations, so give us sort of a real world experience. So that's sort of on-screen exam. So that's sort of what's trying to be brought in. Then you've also got the online exams, which I think is obviously what you're referring to. This is, I think, has been trialed with some distance learning companies, and it's where the students actually get to sit the exams at home, so log in at the set time and complete the examination remotely.
Yeah, is it King's or Interhigh or one of these, I think?
Yeah, I believe King's Interhigh, I think, is the one that I think's been, and EdXL have sort of mentioned is trialing it for them.
Okay, so that's something to keep our eye on, I think.
Yeah, it's certainly something to keep an eye on. Obviously, I think, like I said, it's not going to be like an instant flick a switch, oh, we'll suddenly go in. That, I think it will be a steady process. And obviously there's always, with on-screen exams, online exams, there's always like trepidation of, what if something goes wrong? It's obviously a lot harder to resolve, particularly if a student is sitting it remotely at home, than if the student is there in the exam room with a paper on the desk. So yeah, I think there's, it's going to take time for those to come into play.
Yeah, and it's interesting because my daughter has laptop use, and I really fought against it in my head for years because I feel like there's so many things that can go wrong when you're using tech. Whereas if it's just like a pencil case and a printout, I feel like not so much can go wrong. Although I have to say, not your exam centre, but I have heard a lot of stories that go wrong, even just with pens and bits of paper. So these things happen. Okay, so practicals. When it comes to the sciences, now, as I said, most home educators sit IGCSE EdXL. I mean, that is just the standard one, sciences that home educators sit. But there is the GCSE option, and I know that for A-levels, there are practical endorsements that you don't need to do, but most universities, especially if you want to do a science degree, will want to see the practical endorsements. So talk to us about practicals.
Sure. So, I mean, as you touched on, for A-level biology, chemistry and physics, there is this practical endorsement. And this is purely designed to assess a student's practical skills for the A-level, because obviously they are a heavy practical-based subject. So, I mean, the exam board state there's basically a set number of practical activities that students need to basically show competency in. And these are assessed by what's referred to as the common practical assessment criteria. And basically, the students sort of need to attend labs, do these set practical activities, and then they're sort of being assessed against this criteria. And then, all being well, those that demonstrate the required level of competency across all the requirements of that CPAC, they'll receive a pass grade, which is then reported on their certificate. So on their certificate, they would have, the A-level grade. So we say A-level biology, whatever letter grade is, and then just underneath it says practical endorsement, and then it will say, all being well, hopefully a pass. Obviously, students that didn't show the required standard would receive a not classified, or those students that declined the opportunity to complete it, again, would see that not classified.
And particularly for A-levels, and I'm aware this is a bit of a niche audience, but there are some of us whose children are doing science A-levels. You have to pay for the practicals. There are certain centres around the country that do the practicals. I know that your exam centre has just started doing the practicals, I believe, right, for A-levels?
So we've been doing the practicals since day one. So the new A-level syllabus, they came in, they started in 2015. The first assessment was 2017. So since 2017, we've done the practicals every single year, apart from 2020 for obvious reasons. And yeah, I mean, the thing we have added in now is, so we purely used to just offer the AQA exam board, but what we've introduced over the past year is we've sort of expanded our practicals so that we've created them so they can be sort of tailored to all four exam boards. So you can do OCR, AQA, Pearson EdXL, or EduCAS with us now for the practicals. And the way, obviously, we do this, and I think probably most centres do, is it's sort of a week-long course, so sort of 4 or 5 consecutive days, so that the students sort of come to the location, they attend for these days, and during those 4 or 5 days, they will do the set practical activities. I mean, the minimum is 12, so at our centre, these students will do the 12 required practical activities across those days. And like I said, at the end, all being well, they'll hopefully pass.
I think we tend to worry when we home educate that we're not exposing our child enough to practicals or to experiments or to, that a lot of us had that experience at school with like the Bunsen burners and the potassium tests and all that stuff, right? And we've got these kind of fond memories of it. Well, if anyone is worried about that, I did a really interesting podcast, which I believe is the biology IGCSE podcast that I put out with a biology teacher, where she kind of reassures us that actually there's very few practicals get done in schools nowadays. It's actually quite difficult to do practicals in schools nowadays. And I think that although the practical endorsement, particularly for A level, is very expensive, I paid, I think, about between £700 and £800. We did a Biograd up in Liverpool or Sheffield. I always get those two confused. And it was expensive, there's no doubt. But my son did the week, and he literally went from wanting to do theoretical physics at university to wanting to do engineering at university purely because he had this week when he was doing the practicals and he really liked it. So I think there is, as well as the fact that you need it for your exams, there is, particularly for A level, there is a lot of value to doing this week's worth of practicals. And it is a lot of money, but sometimes as home educators, we are just paying money out, and sometimes it's worth it for the experience that your child gets. Okay, so that's practicals, that's orals, that's coursework. We've talked a little bit about access arrangements. We've talked about different exam sittings, and we've done a little bit about how exams work and tips and advice.
The only thing I was just going to jump back to, when we touched on coursework, we mentioned that we were discussing GCSE English language. Obviously, what I would generally consider in terms of coursework, the main subjects would be the A levels in, obviously, as you know, history, English language, English literature. These would be what I would consider sort of the key coursework subjects for a private candidate. And it's just, I think, important that people are aware for these types of subjects that they do need to be, working with, a teacher, tutor throughout the process that can supervise and authenticate the work. That's just sort of, I think, an important detail to establish, because we do get people that come to us, and obviously we explain to them that you will need to be working with someone that we've appointed to support you throughout. And it seems to catch some people by surprise that that's a requirement, but obviously it is one of those details that the exam will say. And obviously at the end of the process, there is forms and paperwork to be signed just to say that it has been carried out under these sort of guidelines.
Yeah, and I know that we did a podcast episode on computer science, and the same thing applies there.
Yes.
There's and you have to kind of do it really quite early. You can't just leave it to the last minute and be like, oh, can you endorse my thing? Because actually, realistically, there's no time. Exactly
that. And because sometimes you'll get an A-level student come to us and say, oh, I've done it, but I've just been doing it by myself. And unfortunately, it's like, it doesn't work in that. The teacher needs to see, from start to finish, the progression of that coursework and be involved throughout. It's not something just at the end you can say, oh yeah, this is your work. It is, like I said, it needs to be done early on. And there are rules, aren't there, about how much the tutor can be involved in, not involved, and how much, and the exam centre can't be the same as the tutor, etc., etc. Yes, there is. Yeah, there's sort of guidelines. So there's certain things that, a tutor, they can't be giving like indication of marks to the student. There's very strict guidelines that the teacher tutor would need to follow, when sort of supporting that student, but nonetheless needs to support them throughout the process. Yeah, it's really hard. And my son did history A level, and it was really, really difficult. And the coursework, as a home educator, finding a tutor that understands not only the home education sector, but A level in the home education sector, I mean, it's almost impossible in actual fact to find that. So it's one of those where if you are thinking of doing something like history or something coursework based for A level, I would strongly recommend you join the Home Educating Through A Levels Facebook group, which is only a small group because there's not many of us. I think it's like a few thousand, but all the people in there have done this before you, and it's really, really worth joining that because yeah, I mean, it's hard. There's no doubt about it. Okay, so thinking about rules and the fact that there are rules, what about the rules when it comes to exams? Well, I think, like you said, I'm sure you know them off by heart as well as I do. So yeah, I mean, there's for a lot of it, I try to say to students, like, it's common sense that, when you turn up for an exam, you should have your pencil, your clear pencil case, with your stationery inside. If your exam requires a calculator, that's fine, but there should be no lid, case to that calculator. Obviously, students can bring a water bottle with them, but they shouldn't have any labels.
Can the water bottle have, this is a question I'm asking because I was asked this by my son, can the water bottle with no labels have opaque liquid in, for example, orange juice?
It should just be water. I would say if any student is planning on bringing a drink that isn't water, they should really speak to the exams team at their centre in advance, just to sort of ask, one, can they, and sort of usually explain why they may need to. Obviously, we have students, for instance, a diabetic student may need to bring in Lucozade, which, again, as long as they bring that to our attention in advance, would be absolutely fine, obviously, with the labels clearly removed. But that obviously would be non-water based. So, it is fine, but it just needs to be cleared with the centre in advance.
Okay, so clear water bottle, no labels, calculator without a case, clear pencil case, or just carry the stuff.
Yep.
And I know that there's a no watches rule. Is that because of smart watches, or is that for another reason?
Yes. So obviously the big rule, and you've heard me say it countless times, is, and I will always start before any exam, is telling students no mobile phones, no electronic devices whatsoever. So no smartwatches, no earbuds. If it's electronic, you can't have it. But as you touched on, you can't no longer have a wristwatch. And the reason for that is purely because I think with the development of smartwatches now, it's just easier to just have a blanket ruling of no watch, rather than centres, invigilators having to work out, is that a smartwatch? Is that just a standard wristwatch? It's just far easier to just say no watches, full stop.
Okay, do you have a rule about hoods or hoodies?
If a student wants to wear a hood, we wouldn't stop them. Again, I think, we would ask that they bring that to our attention in advance to make us aware, because one thing we will ask them and make sure they're aware of, because the other thing a student will need to bring as a private candidate is a form of identification. Obviously, the classic example is a passport. So obviously, because we don't know who you are, you've obviously registered, we have no idea who you are. Obviously, as the exams go on, we will learn who you are. And obviously, there's certain students, as you know, I don't need to ID your children anymore. I know exactly who they are. But to begin with, we always have to check IDs. And if you're wearing a hood that's sort of covering, we may have to ask you to briefly remove that hood. And obviously, during COVID times, when students were wearing masks, we'd obviously had to ask them to remove the masks just briefly so that we could check IDs. But yeah, we wouldn't have any issue with a student wearing a hood if it made them feel, particularly made them feel more comfortable in the exam environment.
It must be quite difficult to navigate, because I worked at a school in Handsworth back in the day. That was a lot of fun, as you can imagine. And the girls used to have their hoods up, and they used to have earphones, much as I'm wearing now, and you probably cannot even see them, right? They're dark, they're tucked in, I've got long hair. It must be quite difficult. Do you ask people to move their hair back? What's the rule?
Yeah, so obviously when you've just touched on it, so when a student that is obviously asking to wear a hood, that would be something obviously we would be vigilant and checking to make sure they didn't have any earpieces or earbuds or anything like that within their ears. Yes, you have touched on it. It is very difficult. Obviously, you are sort of looking at students with long hair or anything that's covering their ears to make sure nothing's in there. You can generally tell if a student did have something like that, because obviously they're generally touching their ears and things like that. So yes, it is something that, particularly in recent years, that we've had to brief our invigilators to be sort of checking for, where you think, has that student had anything like that? Obviously, as you hear, we always tell students at the start they shouldn't have any of these items, and if they were found to have any of them, then they would face the consequences of possible disqualification.
all of these rules, there's always ways that people are going to cheat if they want to cheat, right? It's just, that is just the nature of things. It's like airport security checks. You want to put a bomb on a plane, you're going to find a way to put a bomb on a plane.
Yeah, I always, again, you literally hit the nail on the head. Like, I will say that to my invigilators, is like, there's only so much we can do, but obviously we just need to be doing our utmost to try and prevent these. But as I said, if a student is going to go to great lengths to try to cheat, I'm sure they will. I think one of the advantages that a private centre has, such as us and others, is that for most of the students, they've never been to the venue before they sit an exam. So for a lot of them, they actually have no idea what they're stepping into, which obviously for some students is obviously a cause of concern. And obviously we do our best to try and alleviate those concerns. But again, I think a student who was thinking about trying to maybe take advantage of cheating, I think they would obviously be running a risk not knowing how it's going to work. Obviously in the school, obviously they might think, oh, I can do this, and I know that the teachers aren't watching me here and there. But like I said, they would be, I think, taking a huge risk in a private centre to attempt to do anything of the sort.
So let me ask you briefly, when we're talking about headphones, what about noise cancelling, over the ear kind of things for people that maybe don't like a lot of noise, anything like that?
Yeah, so again, these are things that students should be bringing to our attention when ideally when they register, if not, certainly in advance of the exams, particularly if there was, if they've got a medical diagnosis. So obviously, we get a lot of students that maybe do have like sensory issues, and, in that case, it's absolutely fine as long as they are, non-electronic. So just like your classic ear defenders. I always say to students that if it's like you'd find on a building site, like, workers wearing, that's absolutely fine. We will check them, of course. As a student comes in, we will ask you to show us them. But yes, we wouldn't have any issues if there was certainly a reason for the student wearing them. That wouldn't be a problem whatsoever.
Okay, and lastly, what about toilet breaks?
Yep. So if a student needs to go to the toilet, they certainly can do. They just need to, much like anything during an exam, if they need anything, or if they need the toilet, just raise their hand, and obviously they will be escorted by an invigilator. The invigilator they don't go into the toilet with them, they'll stand outside, and then when they finish, they'll be escorted back to their desk. As you know, I think with students, obviously, it all seems very daunting at first, and I can completely appreciate that. But I think hearing those rules, if you're doing a number of exams, after 1 or 2 days, you will quickly relax into it. And I always joke with students that, like, by the end, you will be bored of my voice, because you'll have heard it countless times. And you see it when you go out prior to taking them into the exam room and you're speaking to them, and you just see their eyes, like by the end of June, they're sort of just like rolling their eyes. They're just like, and it's just like, I know you've heard this now so many times, you're bored of it, but I still have to say it. But they just do it, and it all works like clockwork. When the students are coming to an exam room, the time it takes at the start of an exam series to the time it takes at the end of an exam series, it's fraction of the time by the end, because students, they're just into the rhythm, they know what they need to do. And I think just one thing I always like to try and get across to home educated students is that by going to a private centre, it is more relaxed than a school, partly because there's less students. Obviously, if you're in a school, you're looking at hundreds sitting any exam in a sports hall or a hall. The maximum we would go up to is 70, 80 in a room, which I still appreciate is a large number, but it is less. And obviously there's no uniform, so you haven't got that to worry about. And because of that range of student ages and backgrounds, I think it just creates for a far more relaxed atmosphere. And also everyone wants to be there. They're dedicated, they're motivated. You don't get those disruptive presences in our exam rooms. Obviously, you'll get those students that may have a cough or a cold or what have you. But in terms of actually like wanting to sit that exam, I would say everybody in that room is completely motivated. So they just want to get their head down and get on with it.
Yeah, and I think I did an exams podcast quite soon after we first started, and in it I said that I would always recommend, if possible, using an exam centre for your exams, because I know that sometimes your local school might be a lot cheaper. If it's completely free, then I can see why you might want to do it. However, if you're just doing it because it's closer or because it's a little bit cheaper, you do need to bear in mind that when it comes to your local school, chances are you will be limited to sitting the exams that they are sitting. Not always, but generally. So whereas an exam centre, it's literally their job to do the exams. They'll do most of the qualifications, if not all of them. And like you say, it is just a more informal setting, and it just feels a lot less stressy, I think. Okay, I wanted to ask you very briefly before we move off rules. When I was doing my exams a long time ago, we used to be able to take the exam papers home with us. When did that stop?
It's a good question. I cannot answer that one for you, because whilst I have been an exams officer, it has always been the rule that nothing leaves the exam room.
It's such a shame. Because, like, I was really gutted the first time my children sat an exam. I was like, where's the paper then? Where's the paper? Let's have a look.
I would say obviously for most subjects, they are answering on the paper. So there is that. But yes, I mean, for certain subjects, I just like for AQA level history, they have a paper and then they have an answer booklet. But no, that one, I would have to look into for that one, because as far as I've always known, it's been nothing leaves the exam room whatsoever.
Okay, so when we were talking about noise cancelling headphones and toilet breaks and all that kind of thing, I think that leads us nicely into special consideration.
Okay, so special consideration is the term we use basically where they're experiencing like they're ill, or basically something outside of their control that's likely to have had an effect on their ability to take the exam, to demonstrate their fullest potential. So that's what we would refer to as special consideration.
Something unexpected.
Spot on, yeah. So that's exactly how I try to say to students is access arrangements is things that you would literally we put in place, we plan for it. Special consideration is things that are out of your control and obviously has affected you at the exam. So the classic examples is like students ill, or they've had an accident, injured themselves at the time of the assessment, suffering a recent bereavement, or if there was a domestic crisis of some sort at the time of the exam. These would be like the classic reasons for special consideration. I do try to say to students, obviously with special consideration we can inform the exam board, but it will only ever go so much to sort of compensating the student. Yeah, there's different ways. So you've got, if we break it down, there's sort of two different special consideration categories. You've got those that were at the exam and what we would say is disadvantaged. So so those students turned up for the exam and maybe they've feeling under the weather, or the classic one in the summer series is suffering with hay fever.
Or they've got no chair to sit on, or they're made to wait for 3 hours before they can get into the exam, or they're given the wrong paper, or any of these horror stories that I hear from like different exam centres. So I'm guessing this was something you would flag up at the time and say, do you know what? This wasn't on.
Yeah, exactly that. Or if, there was, again, some, disturbance at the exam. So if there was like severe noise or something outside, anything like this is where the centre reports it to the exam board, explains this has happened, whether it be to the individual student because they were ill, or again, if it affected the whole cohort because of a noise issue, anything like this, we tell the exam board, and then what they will do is they'll normally apply an allowance of additional marks to the paper affected. The size of the allowance very much depends on the timing and the extent of either the illness or the misfortune that the student suffered. The maximum that will ever be given is 5% of the total raw marks of the paper.
Wow, that's the most you'd ever get.
That's the most, and that is reserved for a terminal illness of, say, an immediate family member, or a death of a member of the immediate family, or a very serious disruptive crisis at the time of the exam. Most typical, special consideration applications are in that sort of 1% to 3% category. That's where things like illness, that would sort of fall in usually the 2% category. Hay fever at the exams usually into the 1% category. You'd get, just this a few extra marks based on whatever the raw marks of the paper is. it's interesting. I chat to students about this a lot, and particularly this summer series, the question came up quite a bit. Obviously, students saying to me, "Well, what's the point?" But then my response is, "You've got nothing to lose." We usually ask you to fill in a short form to do that, like a self-certification form, and it could very well be the difference between a grade boundary.
Would there be an argument for saying that if, as it's so low, would there be an argument for saying that if you've sat one paper and you've got a second paper to go, not doing the second paper if you're really ill, and then don't they sort of gauge it from your first paper?
So you basically, so bringing us on to the second category is, so if a candidate was absent from, a component for what we deem acceptable reasons, so again, illness, these things we've touched on, in that case, basically what the exam will do is they will issue a mark for the missing unit, based on they'll take into account the marks the student achieved at the other papers, so sort of look at their performance in those papers, and also like the national average as well. So they'll look at the student's performance, the national average. They do make the assumption, obviously, that the student will perform as well, no better or no worse than what they did on the other papers. And they'll issue this mark for them, and then that'll sort of fill in, and then they can still calculate an overall grade. To qualify for that, the students for GCSE and A-level linear specifications, students do need to meet a certain criteria, and that, basically they have to have done 15% of the total assessment. So pretty much they just need to have done one component, because I can't think of too many components at GCSE or A-level that are under 15%. So usually if they've done one component, then they would just qualify for this if they were unable to sit any exams for acceptable reasons. But yes, if you touched on, if a student was severely ill and has sat a paper, then that would be probably the best route to go down. We've had students before where maybe, they've dragged themselves in to sit an examination, and, they know afterwards that they haven't performed to their very best. And maybe in those situations, the student should have just sort of held their hands up and said, "I'm not fit enough to sit this examination." Because there is this, special consideration does exist for those students for a reason.
Okay, and talking of not turning up for exams, just briefly, at what stage can you cancel an exam, like all of the papers, and it not be classified as a fail or unclassified or whatever?
Let's say a student didn't turn up for any of their exams this summer, we could still now request to the exam board that they be withdrawn, so that there is no mark recorded, against their name.
Okay, that's good to know.
So it can still take place after the exam series.
Okay, so special consideration sounds like a big con, but at least we now know. I always assumed it would be like you'd get, I don't know, like 40% or something, but no.
No, I think, like they said, I think what they tried to say is that it can only go some way to assist a candidate affected by potentially, things they've experienced. And I think for those that it's vital for those that miss a component. So like I said, if you have to miss an exam because you are severely ill, or you've experienced, a bereavement or anything like that, then the fact that they can issue you a mark for that paper and you can still get a grade, I think is vital. And particularly in recent years, on the back of obviously the pandemic, when obviously got COVID, you still had to isolate, particularly in the 2022 series, students were having to miss papers left, right, and centre because they were testing positive. That was, a lifesaver for some of them, because it meant they could still get their grades, their qualifications. But I do, understand the frustration that if you're there, you're feeling under the weather, that the maximum extra raw marks you're going to get is 1 or 2%. So I can certainly understand the frustration that some students have with that offering.
Yeah, so I think the takeaway there is that if you're so ill that you think you're going to underperform by more than 5%, or really 2 or 3%, you may be better off just not turning up for that paper.
I think there's definitely a fair point to make. I think, if you're going to really under the weather, definitely look to the special consideration route.
All right, and just quickly before we move on to results and certificates and the kind of post-exams thing, I know that this summer there was an AQA, I believe it was A-level physics, that was in the news for being very, very hard. And my son actually was doing OCR, and he was in the same exam hall at the same time as the people doing AQA. And he came out and he was buzzing. He loved his OCR. He was like, yeah, brilliant. I love that. And the AQA guys were like falling on the floor, dying. So just to reassure our listeners, when there's a hard paper, like a really hard paper, and everyone comes out and are like, oh my God, that was a nightmare. And all the teachers are like, oh, they asked things we weren't expecting. That's okay, isn't it? Because it's kind of is it called graded on a curve? Or I'm not sure what the term is, but
so basically how it works is they don't set any grade boundaries until all the papers have been marked. So, all the senior examiners, so say for AQA this summer, on the back of that particular physics paper, they will see how nationally students performed. If they can compare it to previous and go, actually the marks are significantly lower on previous years, they will then think, oh, maybe the paper was harder than previous years, in which case they will lower the grade boundary so that, to get a grade, students didn't need to achieve as many marks. So, the grade this is why we see fluctuations between grade boundaries each exam series. Yes, they usually stay in the same sort of ballpark, but this is why there are discrepancies from year to year, because of when the examiner's markers sort of decide post-exams, how difficult or, conversely, how easy a paper may have been compared to previous years.
So what would happen is there'll be a kind of quota of papers that are going to get the highest grade. It's just the grade may be less high than previous years, so they'll still get an A star.
I don't know if they work on quotas. I think they work on the basis that they'll say, well, actually, where previously that level was what we'd say was a C, they'll say, or actually probably because the paper was a bit harder, actually that will sit where the B category is, and then again they'll just then see how the marks fit in, and obviously like on the scale, and then they'll go, actually, so these students therefore get A star, these get A. So I don't think they're looking at quotas, they're purely looking at the paper as a whole and where it sort of sits compared to previous years. They've been keen to try and sort of get this message across. So I think I know AQA in particular have been putting posts out, I think, on their social media platforms and on their website to try and explain how it works with grade boundaries, how they are decided. So I'd say if anyone wants probably further information about that, I know AQA have been very good at trying to, publicize that information.
Yeah, I think AQA is, I used to call it the multiple choice exam board because all of their papers seem to involve a lot of multiple choice. But actually, they're very kind of, maybe I should rename them the cuddly friendly exam board, because I think they're actually kind of quite nice in the stuff that they give out. I used to mark for EdXL actually, and that's why I don't say that they're cuddly friendly. So Cambridge, however, are like the Death Star as far as I'm concerned. So yeah. Okay, so results and certificates, before I get myself into trouble. Talk to us about results and certificates.
Sure. So I mean, results days, I think most people seem to be obviously aware. So in the summer, so they got the summer exam series, results come out in August. It's usually the middle Thursday for A-level results, and then the following Thursday is GCSE results. Most people seem to be aware of these days because obviously the media like to have students, the shots of students opening up their results. Most people seem to know about those ones. One thing to make people aware of is exam centres aren't allowed to release the results to students until after 8 o'clock. So you sometimes used to get people saying to us, oh, why are you not sending me my results straight away, or stroke of midnight sort of thing? And it's because the exam boards actually state we cannot release that information until 8 o'clock bang on is when we can start sending that information. So that's what we do. So we as a centre send everything out via email. Obviously, other centres will use other means. Can't imagine too many are still sending it out via post, but you never know. The one I like to bring more people's attention to is, so if you do your exams in October, November, so the autumn series, those results come out in January. So you're looking usually like the GCSEs, they come out sort of early January, as do like the Cambridge International A-levels. And then you'll probably find the Cambridge International GCSEs come out mid-January, and then the EdXL IGCSEs sort of come out the back end of January. Again, obviously we still follow that same procedure, sending out the results, but it's just January is the month, sorry, for the autumn results. And then the certificates, again, just making people aware that they don't come out straight away. It's usually 8 to 12 weeks. I mean, you're looking at the January, following on from the January results, they usually come out, usually sort of end of March, beginning of April time. And then for the summer results, so they come out in August, and then you'll find the certificates come out usually beginning of November.
And if anybody wanted replacement certificates for any reason, they would contact the exam board, yes?
That's correct, yes. So yeah, contact the exam boards. Obviously, they do charge you a fee for that service, but they will be able to not necessarily issue you a replacement certificate, but they'll like issue like a certified statement of results. Then these are the grades that you have previously achieved through our exam board.
Okay, perfect. And what about if somebody gets their result and is like, "Hey, up! I was expecting 3 grades higher than this." So what about appeals?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, it's referred to as like review of marking. So this is where a student can request that, a particular paper, all papers if they wish, sort of ask us, and we submit a request to the exam board. And what they'll do is they will check that the mark scheme has been applied correctly to the student's paper. So usually they will get a new marker examiner to check it, so it'll be completely independent from the first one. And then what you usually find is a few days, so it can take up to 20 days for that. You'll get then a copy of the script, and it will sort of show like the original marks and then the review of marking to sort of show if they line up or if they've gone up or gone down, because that's one thing to be aware. They can go down as well as up. So, I mean, I know some students obviously say, well, the grade's worthless to me unless it does go up, so I've got nothing to lose by going down. But it is something that they do need to be aware of, that, equally could go down as well as up. There is a priority service as well. So students that had a place at higher education, a university place dependent on the outcome, they can request a priority, and that's done within 15 days. So, it's slightly quicker. Obviously, with these services, it can result in grade changes. We try to hopefully measure students' expectations that, if you've done a GCSE maths exam and you are over 10 marks or so away from a grade boundary, we tend to try and say that a review of marking isn't going to see that increase that you're hoping for, because it's unlikely that the marker has incorrectly applied it that many times. Like, you might find, hey, 1 or 2 marks, but it's unlikely that you're going to see that significant jump. For other subjects, essay-based subjects like English, history, you may find that. But I think on the whole, from our experience, you'll find that you need to be sort of close to that grade boundary, few marks away really to hope, because the markers that are grading these papers, for the most part, obviously they've done extensive training. You'd like to think that hopefully they're applying that mark scheme correctly first time. So I would say 9 times out of 10, from our experience, you request the review of marking and it comes back the same mark that it was originally. And there's, the other service that students can go for, there's others, but the other key one would be access to scripts. So this is where they can get back copies of their papers, so they can get these, review them. This is, if they've got time, it's always good to maybe get back their scripts, have a look at them, maybe with a tutor, because then they can sort of see, actually, do they think there is grounds for that review of mark and request? And then obviously they can go for that if they want, but sometimes they might look at the papers by themselves or with like the tutor, and they might just realize actually probably the grade they've received is accurate.
And how much is it to get the scripts and to do a review of marking?
So then, in terms of the review of marking, it varies between exam boards. So I haven't looked at the fees yet for this summer. So that's my job, one of my jobs for the next few weeks, to look at that. In terms of access to scripts, so actually requesting the scripts, the exam boards don't charge a fee. Centres may charge a small admin fee just to do that for you, just to cover the time they've spent doing it. But so yeah, access to scripts, is usually just a small minimal fee to do that, and just then the students can, have a look at them.
What's the ballpark figure for review of marking?
Review of marking. Ooh.
Are you talking hundreds? Are we talking?
No. It depends if you've obviously got to do multiple papers. So, I mean, probably it depends on GCSE or A level. You could be looking somewhere between £40 and £60 per paper. So obviously, if a subject's got multiple papers and you want multiple, yes, that fee can quickly add up. But yeah, and again, if you go for if it was like an A level, or you had that place at uni and you're going for the priority service, again, the fee goes up again because the exam would charge more for them doing it quickly.
Yeah. Okay. And I've got down here post exams, and it kind of made me smile when I saw that we were going to talk about this, because as far as I'm concerned, post exams is like, free and easy, right? There's like nothing to think about. So is there anything that I should be thinking about post exams?
None whatsoever.
That's a
I don't think
bonus.
so. I always think, for this, I think once the students completed their exams, they should just rest easy until that results day. And, I know from experience, obviously, you try not, you sometimes dwell on papers, but it's just that it's best just to not to think about it, just put it to the back of your mind because it's, for some people, it's 2 months that you are waiting 2 months, A-level students, maybe a month and a half, but it is a long time. So, just put it to the back of your mind and enjoy your summer.
My daughter came out of her history GCSE this summer, and I met her right outside. We walked about three steps, and she said, "Oh, I just realized I spelt Britain wrong for the entire exam." I was like, well, whatever. Don't know what you meant. So what about resits? I think resits is the last thing on our list to talk about.
Yeah, I think the only reason it's worth talking about resits is that basically the cycle obviously starts again, but there isn't a special. I think some people have this misconception that all subjects, including A levels, are available to be retaken in the autumn, but that's not the case. It goes back to what we said right at the start of the podcast was, you've got these 2 series, you've got the autumn, you've got the summer, and, if the subject exists in that series, then you can retake it. But if it doesn't, so for instance, if the subject you want to retake, i.e. all A levels, isn't available in the November series, you are going to have to wait until the following summer to have that retake opportunity, which I know is a frustration for many students. But unfortunately, until the exam was obviously changed that, obviously it is a case of having to wait till the following summer. Obviously, for certain subjects, when it comes to retakes, I'm thinking of the practical, the A-level sciences, and those with the coursework. These subjects, students don't need to be redoing their practical endorsement. Like once you've done that, and if you've got that pass, that will stay with you. You can carry that forward, so you don't have to redo the exams. With the coursework subjects like history, English literature, English language, if you are happy with your coursework mark, this can be carried forward as well. So when you're doing your retake, you might not have to do as much work as you did the first time. But like I said, sadly for A levels, you are waiting a year. And in terms of GCSEs as well, unless it's that English language or maths, and again, you still have to be 16 or over for it, you're going to have to wait until, again, the following summer. Advantage really plays into those that have done the IGCSEs or the Cambridge International A-levels, because these are what are available in October, November, and obviously students can retake them then, should they need to.
Okay, so I've got 2 last questions for you.
Yeah, of course.
That I haven't prepped you for. So the first question is, are there any changes looming or any new exams coming or anything like that that maybe we haven't heard about, that you have heard about, that you can tell us about?
Not that I can think of. I think you've touched on the on-screen, the online exams. That's probably like sort of, I guess, like the looming the future. Again, this is, I think, generally the information that we get as an exam centre is exactly the same that's on their websites. So it's just information for all. They tend not to give us anything that's what we consider secretive. And the classic example of this is jump back to when we had COVID and they cancelled the exams. We had no prior warning on that. So when they came out and said the exams are cancelled, that was news to us as well as everybody else. So obviously you can imagine the following morning when it obviously, and completely understand, we were none the wiser. And that pretty much is how it is with information within the exam world. I'd say that as soon as there's something to share, they just put it out in the public domain, so it's there for everybody to see.
Yeah, and that whole COVID time, I mean, it was really difficult for us as a family. I had both my two doing exams. It was extremely stressful. Nobody knew what was going on from 1 minute to the next. God alone knows how stressful it must have been running an exam center. It was pretty stressful for me. Okay, so my final question is, and I suspect you're not going to be able to answer this, but I'm going to plow it in anyway. What do you think is the hardest exam to sit, and what do you think is the easiest exam to sit? I know what you're going to say. You're going to say it depends on the child, yada yada. But is there one that you think, wow, that's a tough one, and is there one that you think that's a doddle? That
I'm gonna have to. Well, I would obviously give the diplomatic answer that it really does depend on the student. However, I think it's generally considered, and I think just from like the head of centre, Dr. Monk's, I think when you consider the A levels, I think when you see students doing what he tends, I think we refer to now is the big four, which is, when you see students doing maths, further maths, physics, and chemistry, you just think, wow, that is an undertaking, and it never ceases to amaze me that students that do that combination of subjects.
And they're still not getting into Oxford and Cambridge with 4 A stars in those subjects. I mean, how bonkers is that? What about the easiest one then? What's the easiest one, do you think?
I definitely wouldn't be able to give an answer for that one.
I'm gonna answer it for you, because I tell you what, when I saw Travel and Tourism, Cambridge IGCSE, my daughter sat it. We did no revision. We did not read the textbook. She literally sat it based on just being a human being in the world. It's the easiest exam. I was like, oh dear God, that exam is lovely. Okay, so thank you so much, Paul. I know I put you on the spot at the end, but it's always fun to do that. So tell our listeners, obviously, I've mentioned your exam centre in other podcasts. Everybody I speak to knows that I always flag up 3A tutors, and I'm not alone in this. You're a very popular exam centre for a good reason. But for anyone who's listening that would like to find out more about your exam centre, or would just like to follow you on social media or look at your website, do let us know your links.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, our website is 3at.org.uk, and that is where you'll find all our information. We also have a Facebook page, so you can search for us on Facebook at 3A Tutors. And then I would just say, if anybody has any questions or wants to get in touch, please feel free to, contact us through our website or give us a call through the number on our website. We are here and always happy to help. And, we're a small team here. And if you phone, you will get through to either myself or my colleagues, Peter and Jack. You will get through to one of the three of us, and we all will be here and happy to help.
That's perfect. And I can vouch for the fact that you're super helpful, because I know that when it came to A levels, it was really complicated. And it's a lot, it's a lot of pressure, and you don't want to get the A levels wrong. You don't want to get any of the exams wrong. And I did fire off quite a number of emails to you being like, okay, just to confirm you do these and just to confirm this is right. So thank you so much for your help personally with me and with my children. And thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
No, thank you ever so much for having me. I've really enjoyed it. So thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us for today's Home Education Matters podcast. See you at the next one. Have a lovely day.